I'm an environmental social scientist. I work in a sustainability department. We have an ethos of engaged research, so we do a lot of transdisciplinary projects with communities, with government partners, etc. Probably not the way to start a presentation, but generally I find because I work in a very kind of interdisciplinary manner as a social ecological systems person and a social ecological resilience person, I tend to kind of stitch together what other people do. So what I'm going to try and represent for you today, I cannot take all the credit for. It's the work of kind of 20 odd people through multiple projects, and it's all integrated through a social ecological systems framework, which is usually my piece on the project. So it will be kind of broad strokes covering a lot of things in not a lot of depth, but please feel free to ask questions and I will try and answer them the best I can, or I'll at least be able to kind of find out the answer afterwards from my colleagues and pass it on. So today, fairly standard overview. I'm going to kind of start with the geographical context of the Emoticon basin and where the Gibe III is, then talk a little bit about the theoretical framing of social ecological systems, and then I've got two kind of sets of results. I realised in kind of writing the abstract about our project SIDERA, which has been active for the past kind of 18 months, I needed to go back a step further to the original social ecological systems work we did. So there'll be two different papers I'm pulling from to talk about kind of what we know about impacts of the dam and developments associated with the dam so far, and then I'm going to end on some kind of future research directions. So the Emoticon basin is in the southwest of Ethiopia, and this is Addis up here in the middle. The Gibe III is actually very high up in the basin, and then here is where kind of the first irrigation weir was built. And so most of our focus has actually been kind of below that irrigation weir, and the river kind of does this and comes and ends in Lake Turkana in Kenya. So it's a transboundary river basin. It's a semi-arid climate, kind of getting drier as you go south through the basin. It's traditionally a very kind of culturally diverse place. There's kind of 10 to 15 different ethno-linguistic groups in the region, depending on where you draw the boundaries, and hasn't particularly been integrated into either the Ethiopian state or the Kenyan state, because there was a perception that there was a scarcity of kind of extractable resources, as it were, and a prevalence of endemic diseases that meant people just didn't really go there. So because of that, it's only since the 1960s that the kind of national government has started to really pay any interest. There were a few development plans created in the 60s, 70s, 80s. The first conversations about dams started in the 80s, but really only kind of came into being from 2010 onwards, when Ethiopia introduced kind of these 5-year growth and transformation plans. The dams are not explicitly within those, but the sugarcane associated and supported by the kind of irrigation is. And so this quote from the Prime Minister at the time came to represent the kind of the push for development within Ethiopia, but development in a not necessarily favourable way to the people living in the region at the moment. There was this idea that the region didn't have access to resources that it should do, and it should be brought into the modern world. We can unpack that later, and I'm sure we will. So construction started in 2005 on the Gibe III. The full name is the Gilgal Gibe III, but for shorthand I'm just going to call it the Gibe III. This was nearly a $2 billion US contract handed to the Italian engineering firm Cellini Impreglio. They have a really snazzy video with some drone footage, if any of you are into that kind of thing. I stole a picture from it. It's a big dam for Ethiopia. When it came online, it increased the capacity of Ethiopia by about 80%. About half of the capacity, half of the electricity stays within Ethiopia. The other half is exported mostly to Kenya. And it's had obviously a massive impact on the river basin and the social ecological system as a whole. Everything's gone a little bit squished. Anyway, this is hopefully still readable. So because this is a transboundary river, the Omo River, as it winds through, is responsible for 90% of the inflow to Lake Turkana in northern Kenya. There are about 1 million people in the basin, full stop. The majority of them are actually in the Kenyan side around Lake Turkana and kind of in the county of Turkana. There are about 200,000 people on the Ethiopian side, and about 100,000 of those were dependent on flood retreat agriculture, which obviously is now not feasible. In addition to the dam, which actually isn't even on this map because it's so much further north, what you can see here are multiple blocks that were highlighted for sugarcane development by the Ethiopian government in the first growth and transformation plan. That was going to be about 250,000 hectares, which included parts of 2 national parks that were created in the 60s and 70s. The sugarcane will not be that extensive. They have already had so many difficulties in kind of installing it in the first block, which is this one kind of in the north, that they're not probably going to use the most southerly block, but there is already some construction here. So if I skip around a bit, this is where the weir is at the top, and kind of within the first couple of years, it kind of already stretched kind of about 40k south with the sugarcane. For context, what that's replacing is kind of rain-fed agriculture further up in the basin, flood retreat agriculture most of the way along the Omo and the Lower Omo, and then fishing livelihoods around Lake Turkana, some along the river as well, and generally all kind of groups that use these livelihoods will also rely on pastoralism. So we're mostly looking at a population of agropastoralists. So the question kind of is, there was a lot of attention from human rights groups when the dam was announced, when the sugarcane was announced, when construction began, when cultivation began. There really wasn't a ton of academic interest. So we were, as a group, and I'll get to us in a minute, interested in both what are the impacts of the dam and the associated developments. If there are negative impacts, as human rights groups are kind of saying how can we work with actors, and particularly government actors, to try and minimise those. So along with Jed Stevenson, who is a lecturer at the University of Durham in the anthropology department, he and I formed a group called the Emoticon Research Network, which was trying to bring together anyone that was already active in the basin, or interested in doing research in the basin. It's an interdisciplinary group of social and environmental scientists. At the minute, there's about 55 affiliates. Nearly half of them are from Ethiopia and Kenya. And I think just because of the nature of fieldwork in this region, a lot of them are early career researchers, either PhD students or postdocs or people in their first faculty jobs, because there's a lot of anthropologists in this region. And so having the time to go and work there for months on end kind of goes with being an early career researcher. OTERN from the beginning has been framed around looking at it as a social ecological system. So I just wanted to kind of think about that for a second. This is a kind of theoretical framing I started using in my PhD at UEA, where essentially it just says you can't separate humans and nature, they're intertwined. And so we can think about these as complex adaptive systems, and some of the system kind of dynamics that brings. But for kind of a simplistic thing, you have humans who have actions on an environmental system, and the ecosystem produces ecosystem services that then the humans use. And any kind of action will have a cyclical effect, which can go in both directions. So to study a social ecological system requires an interdisciplinary framing, and most of my work is actually studying the resilience of systems, i.e. their capacity to change, capacity to cope with change, I should say. I'm not going to talk a ton about that today, but I'm happy to answer any questions on it. But essentially the social ecological system becomes a unit of analysis for those kinds of studies. When we first put OTERN together, we were like, okay, what pieces of the social ecological system do we have covered already by our affiliates? And so these are the different kind of research areas people were looking at. You'll notice it's not kind of a full picture by any means, but we did have some hydrologists and remote sensors looking at land cover. There was a couple of ecologists and kind of people from natural resources thinking about natural resource availability. On the social side, we had a lot of anthropologists studying kind of livelihoods and conflict in particular, and then some kind of economists. We had people, particularly from the political sciences, who were studying the kind of villagization processes, which I'll get to, and how these engineering developments were affecting, how they even came to be, and how they then had effects on the local social ecological system. And then I kind of cross-cut the bottom part, looking at kind of resilience and food systems. So it took us a while, but the first thing we did as a group was say, okay, well, how do we combine everybody's knowledge? Everybody's got quite specific disciplinary interests. And so This paper came out in January this year. It's supposed to be a situation analysis of what we knew at that time. It was started in 2016 at a workshop. So as you can imagine, when you've got 18 co-authors from 11 disciplines, piece of cake, worked out really well. But we got there in the end, and we had some NSF support, which was nice for a workshop. And so far, it's obviously of interest to people. We've kind of seen quite a high download rate through Ambio, where it's an open access paper. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about the kind of broad strokes findings from that paper, but then I'm going to say, well, what were the research questions and what did we study in our research project for the last 18 months. So on the environmental side, we had hydrologists, ecologists, and kind of people studying biodiversity. On the social side, we had a lot of focus on, that should say, food security, livelihoods and food security, it's down here, with migration and conflict as well, and then a kind of ecosystem services lens to bring all of that together. Our colleague Sean Avery is a hydrologist, and he's been doing a lot of the hydrological modelling of the impacts on the dam and the irrigation, or the abstraction for irrigation on Lake Turkana. So as expected, we saw a kind of temporary decrease of about 1.5 metres, which kind of was at its peak, I suppose, in October 2015. Depending on the level of irrigation, over the next kind of 10 years, there's the potential to get to a 40 metre decrease, which would separate the lake out into two different lakes, and would essentially remove the current fish breeding grounds and most of the livelihoods that Lake Turkana supports around fishing. That obviously has impacts on the ecology and biodiversity, whilst there are impacts along the river, mostly to do with the kind of the now kind of, you can't do flood retreat agriculture so easily, and there's some biodiversity impacts. We didn't have a lot of primary data on either of those when we wrote this paper. What there was more data on, thanks to my colleague Natasha Garneris here, was impacts on lake productivity. So what she's been tracking is the kind of the fish catch, fish size, fish breeding, etc. And because there's now no annual flood coming down the basin, there isn't the kind of nutrient trigger that triggers the kind of I'm going to get, this is where my biology fails me, like phytoplankton, I don't know, small things that fish eat, and fish breeding. And you also got the loss of breeding grounds from around the edge. So the two most kind of the valued species, which are both native, Nile tilapia and Nile perch, are at risk of being cut by about 2/3 for the commercial fishery. And as a whole, the lake, her modelling shows you could lose up to 50% of the lake's biomass if the lake goes down to the kind of minimum that it could do, which potentially means a collapse in the fisheries, which obviously has other impacts on livelihoods as well. So just to talk about livelihoods for a second, higher up in the basin in the Lower Omo, as I've said, there's about 100,000 people that depend on flood retreat or depended on flood retreat agriculture. This is a kind of model of that system. As the flood recedes, you plant your sorghum first, and then you have squash and then cowpeas closest to the river. And we're talking about very narrow stretches of, this picture's probably not so clear, but this is the sorghum. So it's maybe a couple of metres at most, potentially on quite a steep slope. Other things that the flood did was regenerate kind of dry season grazing lands, which was generally in ponds and wetlands along the edge of the river, and support the forest along the sides of the river, which was also important for foraging and hunting. So not surprisingly, what we've seen from kind of 26 onwards, but when we wrote this paper, we only had evidence for one of the ethno-linguistic groups, the Bodie, was that as there is now no flood retreat agriculture, you've had an increase in food insecurity, worsened by the fact that there was a drought from 2015 through 2017, so there was no rain-fed agriculture really feasible either. And there is the option, if you move into the sugar estates or are moved into the sugar estates, you get some land and access to maize seed. No irrigation as of yet. So this picture is some of the Bodie in their maize fields, which don't look as healthy as they could, perhaps. And also means having cleared the land, there's no trees for shade anymore, and it's a very hot region. So both the kind of dependence on rain-fed agriculture and the dependence on the kind of land that the Sugar Corporation has given them has created kind of further vulnerabilities to drought. as well as a loss of some of the traditional coping strategies. Turkana, our paper showed we haven't really seen any impacts yet, but there potentially are going to be some if the fisheries collapse. It's not the whole population in Turkana, it's about 200,000 of the 800,000, dependent on the lake. But generally the wider population is mostly dependent on pastoralism, and there is a risk that if you've changed the kind of hydrological cycle and recharge in the wider basin, that you won't see the same fodder availability. So there could be potential kind of reductions in herd size necessary as well. There is some good news. I always forget the good news because, you know, it's easy to get distracted by these things. The sugar estates, the construction of the dam has provided jobs, just not often taken by people from the Lower Omo. So generally these are jobs taken by people from the highlands of Ethiopia who migrate into the region for kind of seasonal work. There's also been a lot of Chinese businesses hired to do kind of road building, to do actually quite a lot of the construction of the sugar factories and so on. So they are fine because they have cash flow income to buy cash from outside of the region as well if there are shortages within the region. And there's been some conflict between the migrants and the locals, but doesn't really affect the migrants so much. It mostly affects the local groups. So that's gone a bit over itself. But what I wanted to say is what we've seen is there's both kind of, without putting a kind of negative spin on it, there's just been a change in regime. So from a social ecological systems perspective, the social ecological system looks slightly different now and the dynamics are different to before the dam. And so if you think about splitting this into the different types of ecosystem services, regulating ecosystem services are those that kind of support the provisioning services. So we have things like water availability, water regulation, nutrient regulation. Those have changed. They're actually kind of, it's not necessarily better or worse. The one thing that we don't know a lot about is how regulating ecosystem services to do with disease regulation and pests will change. And as I'll show you in a minute, we're actually seeing more pests now, but it's not necessarily that there are more of them, it's just that it's harder to cope with them, I think. What we kind of thought from a provisioning ecosystem services is that actually you generally overall have an increase in provisioning ecosystem services because the irrigation and the crop production that the irrigation supports is far more kind of productive per hectare than the traditional kind of sorghum production maybe was. It's just not in food crops at the moment, it's in sugarcane and cotton. And so the irrigation itself is not a bad thing either if local people have access to it, which currently at the minute they do not. But given the climate projections that show increased drought for the region, it might be something that's particularly kind of important in the next couple of decades. The challenge at the minute is the equity dimensions of this increase in provisioning ecosystem services, that the kind of traditional livelihoods are not kind of supported as much. You've actually got decreased access to water by local populations and decreased production of food crops. With an anticipation that because there's now more competition for them, there'll also be a decrease in kind of the wild foodstuffs and fish and potentially grazing fodder. And again, with respect to cultural ecosystem services, there hasn't actually been a study on that per se. So we were kind of trying to interpret some of the anthropological studies through a cultural ecosystem services lens. And what you did see was that displacement in the north of the basin, especially around the first sugarcane block, had led to a kind of loss of sense of place and attachment to cultural sites. That there was some conflict kind of anecdotally increasing in the area and potentially kind of impacts on mental and physical health because of those conflicts. So by the end of this paper, what we had was a systems diagram, which is this, and it's kind of split. So orange are the kind of ecosystem services, yellow are the outcomes, pink are the kind of drivers. And so the kind of consensus was, if you're an actor who's driving the change, you're doing okay. To be fair, the Ethiopian government are not making as much money as they'd hoped. They haven't been able to get the sugarcane yields they wanted, so they're not able to either use as much sugar internally or export it, which was part of the plan. But they've received, electricity, a lot of electricity, and there is something coming from the sugar estates. The government of Kenya has received kind of electricity, The agro-industry investors are presumably making some kind of profit because they're still there. And there is job kind of and livelihood provision for the migrants into the area. But what you're seeing is the costs, which mostly focus around kind of provisioning ecosystem services that relate to food insecurity, being borne by the kind of local populations. And depending on where you are in the basin, those costs differ slightly. So the Ethiopian government has attempted to kind of create solutions to this. Resettlement was already kind of part of the plan. There was originally, a long time ago, a plan to actually just resettle everybody in the region, and it just which obviously didn't work. So, thus far, the only people who've been relocated are some Bodie and Mercy kind of peoples around the northern Sugarcane block. The villagized communities do get access to arable land. It's supposed to be irrigated. It hasn't been yet. There has been some violent resistance to this, and this is something we can talk about in the questions, but currently right now, in the past kind of 6 weeks, there's been a kind of military campaign happening in the Lower Omo, particularly in the Bodie and the Mercy region, which has just been horrific and has been, ironically, as Abiy got given the Nobel Peace Prize in, so we can talk about that later, but I will get distracted if I talk about that now. So this is not something that the communities have been consulted about or necessarily compensated fairly for either. So that's something that, you know, is a really important thing to focus on as we move forward. A solution that the communities themselves are taking is just to migrate, either kind of within their territorial areas at the moment, to migrate across into other territorial areas of other ethno-linguistic groups, which potentially create some conflict, or to migrate by choice to the sugar estates to try and become, you know, labourers and have a paid income there. Mobility has always been a strategy for resilience in this region, particularly in the pastoralism side, and what you tend to have are extended kind of family networks, where you'll have someone who lives closer to the river who was in charge of agriculture, you know, a group that goes away with the animals, and so you kind of move around your networks depending on the time of year. Mostly that mobility is still happening, but it's now curtailed by the fact there isn't as much arable production, and people are going elsewhere to kind of look for that. So generally what that first paper found was that you do see a kind of regime shift, and the social ecological system has changed pretty significantly. It's a transformation towards a system that's kind of oriented around the production of commodities as opposed to food crops, which it was previously. And that you've seen these mostly kind of the negative impacts are limited to the local ethno-linguistic groups, and that mitigation measures haven't been adequate yet to kind of buffer the increased food insecurity, but that there is the potential for people to benefit from this process, hence why it continues. Because all of this was coming from a kind of review of secondary data and primary data of people in their PhDs, it's not systematic. And so from a social ecological systems perspective, the next step was to think about this for one group or two groups in particular and try and look at all these dimensions and collect primary data on them. That's when the Shifting Inequalities project came in. So this is a project funded through the Development Frontiers programme that ESRC and DFID co-fund. We came up with a snappy acronym of SIDERA. So, you know, I'm no good at coming up with the acronyms, that's what Jed does. But this is a collaboration across King's College University, where my colleague Emma Tebbs is a specialist in remote sensing, Addis Ababa University with the Institute for Peace and Security Studies, with my colleagues Fana Gebresembet and Mercy Fakadi-Mulugeta, and then Jed, who moved from UCL to Durham during the project, and then me at Michigan State. So the goal was to try and hone in on one particular kind of smaller social ecological system and document these kind of changes that were underway and any impacts it had on inequality, with the caveat that we didn't necessarily think how we measured wealth and poverty would be appropriate for all the groups in the region. So we wanted to make sure that was part of the project. And we ended up working in an area called Nyangatom. So how did the Nyangatom actually assess wealth? And how has that changed for them over time? Nyangatom are at the bottom of the basin. They're on the Ethiopian side still, but their territory goes into South Sudan. They're a traditionally kind of pastoralist group, but they have communities up and down the river who were dependent on flood retreat agriculture. They haven't been affected yet. They're in the block that was the last block to be, I shouldn't say they haven't been affected. The sugarcane they haven't been resettled for the sugarcane yet, but they were planned to be so. It's now not looking like they will be. This is a particularly politically sensitive region, and so we had to make decisions about where do you go north-south in the basin, and so we ended up in the south, where we had greater access to communities basically, and we're trying to see that kind of separate out the different types of social ecological system drivers, including the dam and the sugarcane. Particularly important from DFID's perspective was that this project ended up in tools that were useful for people either working for DFID or other agencies. And so our pitch was, well, we think we can integrate participatory methods in a way that gives you a tool set that you can go and assess different components of a social ecological system in a kind of engaged manner. And so whilst we've been working in Nyangatom, we've also been doing fieldwork at the kind of zone and national level with government actors and NGOs involved kind of in different ministries and groups. So we were trying to make sure as a result of the project, we created communication across kind of multiple scales, basically. We had to simplify our social ecological systems framing because it was an 18-month project with a budget, and so you can't do everything. So we still started off with this kind of intervention piece at the top, which is the technological developments of the dam and the sugarcane primarily. Our hypothesis was that then this would impact kind of the ecosystem services and the kind of livelihoods and food, which would have an impact on migration and conflict, which would go back into ecosystem services and impact how communities use those. And so what we were interested in is this a feedback loop? Are you seeing a kind of vicious circle in a way, where kind of increased or rather decreased access to ecosystem services challenges livelihoods and food security, which makes migration and conflict more likely, which increases the kind of competition for ecosystem services. So we split into 3 teams, and each had a kind of overarching research question. I was running with Emma the kind of environmental sustainability and degradation group. So what we were looking at is, has the spatial and temporal availability of natural resources changed in the region? Jed was then looking at how that impacted wealth and poverty and kind of measures of material inequality. And Mercy and Fana were looking at then the kind of impacts on peace and conflict within the region. And then the overarching kind of theme was this one of social ecological systems, and me then trying to stitch that together with the group to say, what does this mean for the system as a whole? Our first paper came out this summer on this, which is from our working group, the environmental sustainability one. And again, it's a combination of trying to use those participatory methods to make sure we're representing traditional ecological knowledge with remote sensing to think about how ecosystem services have changed across not just the Nyangatom Warrada, but the wider region, but using the Nyangatom data to kind of scale up, basically. So what we did was a set of kind of participatory mapping activities that happened in parallel with a set of remote sensing activities. The participatory mapping allowed us to come up with some metrics based on the local community's measures of how important different ecosystem services were and how available they were. Those got integrated into the land cover maps to create some ecosystem service maps. The participatory mapping happened in a focus group setting. It was a kind of 3-hour activity on top of a remote sensing image of the area. We split our focus groups by gender. So we had 3 kind of communities that we did this in, and we worked with a group of men and women in each community. We used the language of natural resources because that was easier to kind of translate, but then within the workshop we would be translating those natural resources to ecosystem services for our kind of notes. And so this shows kind of grazing areas. Here are some of the ponds where rain-fed agriculture is being attempted. I should have put the key on, but I didn't. And so what we did was then mark down all the ecosystem services that were mentioned during the mapping to a kind of table that we'd already prepared. We had the community members in the focus group then say, well, where do you find that? Like, is it in the forest? Is it in shrubland? Is it in grassland? Is it the river? Is it all of them? and then rank basically which land cover was most important for each ecosystem service. And then we asked them, we put another acetate layer on top, and shown here, said, okay, has this changed, increased, decreased, or the same? So we also had a measure of trajectory over time, pre and post the dam, basically. The ranking was done using cards, and this was an adaptation in the field where we're like, oh yeah, we probably need some pictures. And so Emma has all the art skills. I can take no credit for that whatsoever. It worked out pretty well. One of the interesting things that the participatory mapping kind of brought up was that the dam was not the only thing happening in the region. And so there was a drought from 2015 to 17, great rains in 2018, which is when this fieldwork was done, which triggered a locust invasion, which then ate all the crops. And simultaneously, what they found was what we think is fall armyworm. So basically, by the end of 2018, when we were even though we had great rains that year, there was still no harvest. So what you have is a kind of group, even if they're split over here's my the people usually in charge of cultivation versus grazing, very little kind of food produced in the region in the last 3 years, and a dependence on food aid, both through kind of short-term aid and long-term programs like the Productive Safety Nets program in Ethiopia. The participatory mapping basically ended up in showing that the majority of ecosystem services that were related to provisioning ecosystem services were decreasing, but that things related to kind of cultural ecosystem services were increasing, which is because population is increasing in the area, so there are more of these things. There's also more integration by the state, so you're seeing more schools being built. So what we did then was triangulate the participatory mapping with Emma's land cover mapping, and the land cover mapping basically backed up what our participatory mapping had shown, that yes, you've had a change in land cover since Emma mapped from 2000 through to 2019, basically, in 2 different time series. And what you've had is an increase in bare ground, which is partly because of the hydrological changes, but we haven't been able to, none of us are hydrologists, so we need to actually prove that. And partly because you've got increased population and kind of herd sizes that are actually increasing in some ways, and so overgrazing happening and land degradation. Mostly that increase in bare ground came from grassland and shrubland, but the wetlands around the river had decreased too, whereas forest had stayed the same. When we integrated in that kind of ranking data to come up with, it's not the ranking data, when we integrated in the kind of land cover, ecosystem services per land cover that the community had said in the mapping, that gave us a capacity measure. Obviously bare ground has the lowest capacity, you don't get a lot of services from it. Shrubland actually had the highest, which we were a little surprised by, but it provides grazing for the livestock, it provides kind of wild foods, including kind of hunting for bushmeat and timber, fibre and fuel kind of resources as well. And then forests were the next highest. This map is a little hard to see in this light, but essentially there's more yellow. You might just have to trust me on that. And then that got combined into a kind of change over time map, which was also based on the ranking, which similarly showed that shrublands had the highest value. And then it became the ponds and the river, because at this point, they were the only places you could do any arable cultivation. So we hadn't really anticipated the ecosystem service value of the shrubland and the ponds. That was something that came out of the participatory mapping and that we would have missed if we had made assumptions from the literature and kind of put those into a similar type of mapping activity. But what you see here is that the red areas are generally where the kind of negative, the change is negative, and that tends to be because of a loss of shrubland or grassland, coupled with an increase in bare ground. It's not everywhere, which is good, but the area we were working in was down here. And so what Emma did was scale up to the kind of broader region that we thought had those ethno-linguistic groups had similar livelihood strategies and would have similar values. So there's a kind of methodological contribution from this paper. We spent ages writing out the methods, so hopefully it can be used by other people and made better. What it also documented for the first time was a focused ecosystem service study in the Lower Omo, and that I should be careful what I say about causality, but that there is a kind of clear trend pre and post the Gibe III. And most of the changes that people are talking about are because of the loss of the flood. But there are multiple drivers happening simultaneously. And the community are coping. They are demonstrating resilience in that they are still there. They are, accessing certain sources of food, even though it's not necessarily the ones they would want. And the kind of point for us was that a lot of those coping strategies are being provided by non-river kind of land, so the shrublands, the grasslands, the forests. And so there needs to be a strategy for how you protect those environments if that's what the community are now dependent on, rather than just thinking about the river and the loss of kind of flood retreat agriculture and fishing potentially. So that was kind of our little button down here. When Jed's team kind of reported their findings, interestingly found there were 4 different types of wealth that Nyangatom valued, and not generally a decline across all of them. So family size is a really important measure of wealth in this community, and family size is increasing, which has a whole other range of issues. But agricultural wealth is mostly based on crop harvest. That's had a significant decline. Animal wealth, i.e. herd size, is kind of mixed. There have been some really successful vaccination programs, which have meant that herd sizes have actually not been as susceptible to different pests. But there's much less, because of the degradation and the increase in bare ground, it's actually much harder to find sufficient fodder for the herds now, and so they're having to go much further afield to feed the animals. And then cash income was the 4th kind. It's increased, but only for some groups, and this is where the equity dimension becomes particularly important. If you have access to town because you live closer to town, you're more able to kind of get temporary jobs or sell fuel wood or such. So there's kind of uneven benefits from that. And the really interesting thing from us that we'd been anticipating finding from our work in the situation analysis, but didn't really find in the primary data, was that this is a relative time of peace, actually, for the Nyangatom. The groups that they would traditionally have conflict with, those conflicts have been much less, and there are different ways of documenting that, but police reports over kind of violent conflict, as well as local communities that keep their own kind of data. There's 2 hypotheses for this. One is that Nyangatom is actually relatively privileged in that it has its own representative in government. Like it is a formal unit of government, whereas not all of those ethno-linguistic groups are. So they have a sort of local elite who can help broker peace, which mostly has been by communicating with the local and national government to ensure food aid is provided. The other hypothesis is that a lot of the conflict you would see here is cattle raiding. And one of the kind of potential reasons that you don't see that at the minute is because in times of food insecurity, it's not a worthwhile use of your energy. You wait till they get another good harvest, and then the raiding will pick up afterwards when people are better fed and have more energy. So there's this kind of two-port to fight idea that might be playing in there as well. But the findings from Nyangatom are different to what we kind of know from other ethno-linguistic groups. So the interesting thing from a systems perspective is that means there's a delay in the system, potentially. It doesn't mean there's never going to be conflict, it just means that there are strategies that are being used to kind of minimise it. And so thinking about this from a couple perspective, that's interesting, I think. So the project has obviously academic outputs. Every paper has been translated into a briefing note for policymakers. Actually, a lot of the briefing notes were written first, so they're online on the website already, because we wanted to share them in our dissemination workshops, which we did in April. We also, as part of Jed's work on the wealth and poverty piece, made a participatory video with people from across different communities in Nyangatom. So at our dissemination meetings, we showed the video, the idea being it's taking the perspective of local people to their kind of government makers, but trying to remove any safety concerns. They're not in it, they're not shown, they're not named, but they can directly communicate to people who might not know what the lived experience is like. So both the briefing notes and the participatory video were shared at these workshops, which were done at the local level with our communities, at their kind of smallest government unit, the zone government and the national government. I would love to say that's led to any change. It hasn't, but maybe. One thing that we did in these workshops was we had a list of recommendations at the end, but we worked with all those different groups to say, well, what are we missing? What needs to be honed more? What's, you know, and so the list of recommendations is now much, has stakeholders attached to it, basically. If you go to this person or this group or this ministry, this is what we need from them. So that's the next stage, to be honest, to try and work out how to implement those recommendations. Generally, thinking about this from a social ecological systems perspective has showed that there are couplings between these different elements of the system, and looking at it in a systems perspective is useful to try and help understand kind of causality. That there are differentiated impacts for different social groups within the region, and that what the kind of studies have allowed us to do so far is to demonstrate where adaptive capacity is being used. What are the strategies people are using to cope with these changes? There's a lot of short-term coping strategies being used at the minute by communities and households that's buffering the kind of loss of livelihoods. My suspicion is we're reaching a limit to those strategies. There's kind of 9-10 strategies being enacted by various houses according to our data in Nyangatom. If there's any other kind of shock now, you're kind of reaching the end of your capacity to, you know, you're already getting food aid. So if there's any shock to the food aid system, there's not a backup plan. So this is where the idea of resilience comes in, that there are thresholds to those things. And if you go through a threshold, it will push you into a whole other system altogether. But essentially, what I like about the social ecological systems framework is that it provides a way of assessing trade-offs, and it allows us to integrate different methods, different disciplines, and different types of knowledge. So that's what we're going to build on in the future. Again, the recommendations, we are shopping everywhere. We had the opportunity to submit another proposal to DFID and ESRC for impact enhancement funding. So that would be to basically follow up on the recommendations, well, to go through a prioritization process first with the communities to say, there's 40 on this list, we can't do all of them, what do you want us to do? And then it would fund money to basically pilot's not the right word, but at least start bringing in the networks and the consultants and taking the communities to see other irrigation projects at a community level, etc. OTERN has had it sounds really clever when I say we had a strategy. We didn't really have a strategy from the beginning, but it's turned out quite well. That when we started off, we had this kind of disciplinary focus. Everybody needs to write a summary about what they know. Those briefing notes got combined into the multidisciplinary kind of situation analysis paper that I've talked about. We had then a shift to being kind of more interdisciplinary, which is where the SIDERA project comes in. And our next phase is to kind of shift into a transdisciplinary approach, to actually work with the networks that we've started to form through SIDERA to integrate government actors and NGOs and the community to try and actually kind of do something that will help mitigate some of these negative impacts. So having said that, we've only actually done on-the-ground research in one of the kind of 15 ethnic groups in this region. So priority areas would probably to be look at Turkana because of the impacts on fishing livelihoods, but also the Mercy and the Bodie, who are higher up in the basin and already being affected by the sugarcane cultivation. I am not a modeller, but one of my PhD students is, and so we're going to try and create a system dynamics model with the goal that this wouldn't necessarily be useful in any basin in the world with a dam, but that we can isolate some kind of key relationships within the social ecological system and identify kind of cause and effect a little more, because when you've got all these different drivers happening, like the dam and drought and pests, it's quite hard to say kind of what is having what share of what impact. So we were hoping to try and explore that a little more through the model, and then move into this transdisciplinary phase to actually think about how you adapt or transform livelihoods in the region. That's it.